For more than 2 centuries, the name Rothschild family has been synonymous with wealth that seems immune to time. While empires rise and fall, their fortune endures. It is often described as old money, a term meant to suggest refinement, restraint, and permanence. But behind the manicured gardens, carved stone facades, and candlelit halls of their great mansions lies a far more complex reality, one shaped by secrecy, calculation, and an understanding of power that few families have ever mastered. These estates were never built merely as homes. They were instruments. Every corridor, every gallery, every dining room was designed to communicate stability in a world defined by financial volatility and political upheaval. To visitors, the mansion projected timeless elegance. To rivals, it signaled dominance. To governments, it offered reassurance that the family's wealth and influence could be trusted when nations themselves could not. The mansion at the center of this story appears tranquil today. Its architecture borrows from the grandeur of European royalty, its interiors overflowing with art, antiques, and symbols of inherited taste. But this serenity is deceptive. Beneath it lies a history of ruthless financial discipline, strategic marriages, controlled narratives, and an obsession with survival that borders on paranoia. This was not wealth meant to be flaunted recklessly. It was wealth engineered to last. Unlike the industrial tycoons of the Gilded Age, the Rothschilds did not rely on factories, railroads, or visible monopolies alone. Their power moved quietly through banks, bonds, and governments. Their mansions became the physical manifestation of an invisible empire, places where deals were whispered, alliances reinforced, and information flowed long before the public ever knew it existed. What makes this mansion unsettling is not what is openly displayed, but what is carefully concealed. The rooms tell a story of taste and tradition, yet they also reflect control over money, over reputation, and over history itself. Generations lived under strict internal rules governing marriage, inheritance, and loyalty. Nothing about this world was accidental. Comfort was earned, but freedom was limited. Tonight, we look beyond the polished image of old money. We examine how this mansion functioned as a fortress of secrecy, a symbol of continuity built atop fear of collapse. Because the true secret behind the Rothschilds' old money is not how much they had, but how far they were willing to go to make sure it never disappeared. If you want more deep-dive documentary stories uncovering the hidden histories behind legendary families, forgotten estates, and the power structures that shaped the modern world, make sure to subscribe. The mansion did not announce itself as dangerous. That was the point. Set back from the road, framed by trees planted decades earlier, its symmetry suggested order, permanence, and restraint. Visitors, approaching the estate, encountered silence first, then scale. The building rose gradually into view, not aggressive, not theatrical, but confident. This was not a house designed to impress through excess. It was designed to endure. For the Rothschild family, architecture was never just architecture. Every major residence they built across Europe followed the same underlying logic. A Rothschild mansion was a statement to the outside world that the family was stable, respectable, and rooted. But internally, these buildings served a far more strategic purpose. They were control centers, places where wealth was protected, alliances were managed, and the family's internal discipline was enforced. By the early 19th century, the Rothschilds had already learned a lesson most wealthy families would not understand until it was too late. Money alone does not survive. Visibility is dangerous. Chaos is inevitable. And fortune, unless structured with absolute discipline, dissolves within generations. The mansion was the visible shell of an invisible system built to counter those threats. Unlike aristocratic estates that evolved over centuries, Rothschild mansions were often built quickly, deliberately, and with modern intent. They were placed near capitals, transportation routes, and political centers, yet shielded by land buffers and social distance. The location mattered. Proximity allowed access to power. Distance preserved privacy. This balance was essential. Inside, the layout followed a hierarchy that mirrored the family's worldview. Public rooms were expansive but controlled. Dining halls, salons, and galleries were designed to host diplomats, ministers, and monarchs. Art collections served as cultural credentials. Paintings by old masters were not merely decorative, they were signals. They communicated that the family belonged among Europe's ruling elite, regardless of titles. But beyond these public-facing rooms lay another layer of the mansion: spaces few outsiders ever saw. Offices disguised as libraries, accounting rooms hidden behind paneled walls, private corridors that allowed movement without visibility, servant routes that ensured silence and separation. The mansion was both a stage and a machine. The dark secret was not criminality in the conventional sense, it was structural. The Rothschilds built wealth the way others built fortresses. Every risk was anticipated, every weakness was reinforced, and every family member was expected to serve the system. Children born into the mansion did not inherit freedom. They inherited responsibility. From a young age, they were taught that their name was not personal property. It was a financial instrument. Marriages were evaluated not for romance, but for compatibility with the family's long-term interests. Emotional independence was discouraged. Loyalty was mandatory. The mansion reinforced this worldview daily. Privacy existed, but autonomy did not. Meals were formal. Conversations were monitored. Even leisure carried expectations. Music, art, and scholarship were encouraged not for pleasure alone, but because refinement reinforced legitimacy. A Rothschild who appeared crude or reckless endangered everyone. This internal discipline distinguished the family from the flamboyant industrialists who would later dominate headlines. While others built ever larger palaces to showcase sudden wealth, the Rothschilds avoided spectacle. Their mansions projected taste rather than dominance. The message was subtle. This wealth had always been here, and it would remain. Yet beneath this calm exterior ran constant anxiety. The family understood something most of Europe's aristocracy refused to accept: that political systems were fragile. Monarchies could collapse. Borders could shift. Governments could default overnight. The mansion was not just a home, it was an insurance policy. Documents were duplicated and stored across properties. Sensitive correspondence moved through trusted couriers. Financial records were fragmented, so no single location contained the whole truth. Even within the family, information was compartmentalized. Trust existed, but verification always came first. This approach was born from experience. The Rothschilds had risen during an era of revolution, war, and economic instability. They had financed governments that no longer existed. They had survived regimes that turned hostile to bankers, to Jews, and to outsiders. The mansion reflected that memory. It was beautiful, but it was never naive. Servants working in the house understood the rules quickly. Silence was rewarded. Curiosity was punished. Long-term service was valued more than brilliance. The staff became part of the system, watchful, discreet, and loyal. Many served the family for generations, bound by contracts and benefits that ensured compliance as much as comfort. To guests, the mansion felt welcoming. Dinners were elegant. Hospitality was generous. But the warmth was calculated. Invitations were strategic. Seating arrangements mattered. Conversations were guided. Information flowed toward the family, rarely away from it. This is where the myth of old money becomes misleading. The Rothschilds did not rely on tradition to protect their wealth. They relied on constant management. The mansion was not a relic of the past. It was an active instrument in the present. As decades passed, the estate absorbed layers of history without surrendering control. Wars came and went. Empires collapsed. New money rose loudly and fell just as fast. Through it all, the mansion remained, adapting quietly. Rooms changed function. Security increased. Technology was integrated behind old walls. The exterior barely changed. The interior never stopped evolving. The greatest illusion the mansion maintained was permanence without effort. Visitors assumed the wealth sustained itself naturally, like land or bloodlines. In reality, everything inside required vigilance. The family's darkest secret was not hoarded gold or hidden vaults. It was the relentless discipline that made comfort possible. Living inside such a system came at a cost. Many heirs struggled under the weight of expectation. Personal ambitions were often subordinated to collective strategy. Deviations were corrected swiftly. Those who resisted found themselves distanced, financially, socially, or emotionally. Yet from the family's perspective, this was survival, not cruelty. They had seen what happened to fortunes that relied on indulgence. The mansion was proof of their success. It stood as evidence that restraint, secrecy, and control worked. In the end, the Rothschild mansion was less a home than a living doctrine. It taught every generation the same lesson. Wealth is not something you enjoy. It is something you manage, defend, and preserve, at any personal cost. And that is the truth hidden behind the stone walls and manicured lawns. Not decadence, but discipline. Not ease, but vigilance. The dark secret of old money was never excess. It was the fear of losing everything, and the system built to make sure that never happened. As the 19th century progressed, the mansion's role expanded beyond family governance into something far more consequential. It became a quiet extension of the state, not officially, not publicly, but functionally. Governments entered through the front doors as guests and left through side corridors as debtors. Ministers dined beneath chandeliers, while wars were financed in adjacent rooms. The estate did not merely witness history, it lubricated it. The family understood leverage better than most sovereign treasuries. Nations required liquidity during crises, and crises were constant. Wars disrupted tax collection. Revolutions froze trade. Empires overextended themselves. In those moments, speed mattered more than ideology. The Rothschilds could move capital faster than states could mobilize armies. The mansion was where those decisions were coordinated. Correspondence arrived daily, often encrypted in polite language. A request for assistance from one capital might sit beside a warning from another. Information asymmetry was their advantage. Knowing which government was desperate and which was bluffing allowed the family to dictate terms without appearing to do so. Interest rates, bond structures, repayment schedules, these were not abstract numbers. They determined which nations survived intact and which limped into the next decade weakened. The mansion's dining table doubled as a negotiating table. Seating arrangements were deliberate. Who sat closest to the patriarch mattered. Who was invited back the following evening mattered more. Hospitality created obligation. Obligation created influence. Influence translated into stability for the family. This system thrived because it was invisible. Unlike parliaments or palaces, the mansion issued no proclamations. There were no flags, no uniforms, no public decrees. Power operated through trust and dependence. Governments did not resent the family because they needed them. And because the relationship was unofficial, blame never attached. The architecture reinforced this role. Rooms were designed for discretion. Thick walls muffled sound. Heavy doors closed firmly. Windows framed views of gardens rather than streets. The outside world felt distant, even when the capital lay nearby. Decisions made inside felt insulated from consequence. But insulation bred its own tension. The family knew that proximity to power invited danger. Anti-banking sentiment surged periodically. Political scapegoating was a constant risk. The mansion therefore evolved defensive habits. Access tightened. Guest lists narrowed. Security increased without display. Internally, the family refined its rules. Marriages within the extended network were encouraged not only to preserve wealth, but to preserve secrecy. Outsiders introduced unpredictability. Romantic idealism threatened discipline. Love was tolerated only when it aligned with strategy. Children were educated rigorously. Languages were mandatory. Economics was not optional. History was studied not for inspiration, but for warning signs. Every past collapse was analyzed. Every failed dynasty was dissected. The lesson repeated endlessly. Those who assumed permanence invited ruin. The mansion enforced this lesson subtly. Portraits of ancestors lined hallways, watching silently. Their expressions were not celebratory. They were stern, expectant. Legacy weighed heavily. Living under those gazes was not comforting. It was corrective. This pressure produced mixed results. Some heirs embraced the system fully, becoming precise, disciplined, emotionally reserved stewards. Others rebelled quietly, seeking anonymity, art, or exile. A few broke publicly, fueling gossip and reinforcing the family's preference for control. When dissent appeared, the response was rarely dramatic. Allowances were adjusted. Roles were reassigned. Influence was reduced. The family avoided confrontation whenever possible. Conflict was inefficient. Silence worked better. Outside the gates, the myth of effortless aristocracy persisted. Society columns described elegant parties. Visitors spoke of refinement and grace. The mansion appeared serene, almost benign. The darker truth remained internal. Serenity required constant correction. As the 20th century approached, the environment grew more hostile. Nationalism intensified. Banking became politicized. Wars grew larger and more destructive. The family responded by dispersing assets geographically. No single mansion, no single country would ever hold everything. Yet the estate retained symbolic importance. It remained a nerve center, a place where the family reassembled to recalibrate strategy. Even as technology enabled faster communication, face-to-face deliberation retained value. Trust was easier to assess, across a table than across a wire. During wartime, the mansion's role shifted again. Some rooms emptied, staff numbers changed, certain functions went dormant, others intensified. The family adapted without drama. Survival required flexibility. The greatest danger was exposure. If the public ever fully understood the extent of private financial influence, backlash would be swift. The family therefore cultivated philanthropy carefully. Art donations, hospitals, educational institutions, these softened perception. Generosity acted as camouflage. But philanthropy followed the same logic as everything else. It was strategic. Institutions were selected carefully. Causes aligned with stability. Radical movements were avoided. Charity reinforced order rather than challenging it. Inside the mansion, this pragmatism was rarely questioned. Morality was defined by continuity. Actions were justified if they preserved the system. Ethical debates, when they occurred, were resolved privately and quietly. By mid-century, much of the old world the mansion had served was gone. Monarchies fell. Empires dissolved. New financial institutions emerged. Yet the family endured, not because it clung to the past, but because it anticipated change. The mansion absorbed these shifts without losing identity. Art collections expanded to include newer movements, but only after validation. Decor updated discreetly. Technology hid behind tradition. Nothing appeared rushed. Nothing appeared reactionary. The final illusion remained intact, that the mansion was a relic of a bygone era. In truth, it was a living organism, adapting continuously. Its darkest secret was not secrecy itself, but how ordinary that secrecy felt to those inside. For the family, this was normal life. Control was routine. Vigilance was habit. Comfort was conditional. The mansion did not imprison them physically. It bound them psychologically. And so the estate stood, generation after generation, less a monument to wealth than to discipline. A place where history was not remembered fondly, but interrogated relentlessly. Where every success was treated as temporary and every failure as instructive. That mindset, more than money, more than art, more than stone, is what kept the mansion alive while so many others became museums, ruins, or footnotes. By the late 20th century, the mansion's greatest challenge was no longer war or revolution, but visibility. Wealth itself had changed character. New fortunes emerged loudly through technology, media, and celebrity. Transparency became a public expectation. Silence, once a shield, began to look suspicious. For a family built on discretion, this shift was dangerous. The instinctive response was not retreat, but recalibration. The mansion did not open its doors widely, nor did it disappear from public life. Instead, it adopted a controlled openness. Portions of estates were converted into cultural spaces. Selected rooms became galleries. Guided, narratives replaced speculation. What was shown was curated. What remained hidden stayed hidden. This was not generosity. It was narrative management. Allowing the public to walk through certain halls created the illusion of access. Visitors saw tapestries, furniture, and paintings. They did not see the private offices that still functioned elsewhere. They did not hear the conversations that mattered. The mansion became both artifact and active headquarters, depending on which door you entered. Inside the family, debates intensified. Some argued that secrecy itself was outdated, that legitimacy now required openness. Others warned that exposure invited misinterpretation, envy, and hostility. History favored the cautious. The family's long memory carried more weight than modern fashion. The result was compromise. Public-facing roles expanded. Private governance tightened. Internally, the same rules persisted. Wealth remained conditional. Inheritance followed structure. Trust was earned through compliance. The name still came with expectations, not entitlement. If anything, pressure increased. The world outside was less forgiving, more volatile, more inclined to blame unseen forces for its instability. Conspiracy theories flourished. The mansion, once anonymous, became symbolic in public imagination. It represented continuity in an era of disruption. That symbolism attracted resentment. The family understood this risk intimately. Their response was to remain unresponsive. Silence starved speculation of confirmation. Security became more psychological than physical. Physical defenses were discreetly modernized, but reputation management became paramount. Associations were vetted carefully. Political alignment was avoided publicly, even when unavoidable privately. Neutrality was performance as much as principle. The mansion itself absorbed this tension. Its stillness felt heavier. Fewer large gatherings were held. When they occurred, they were quieter, shorter, more controlled. The age of grand salons influencing policy openly had ended. Influence now moved through institutions, boards, and financial instruments far removed from candlelit rooms. Yet the mansion's internal rhythm continued unchanged. Mornings followed schedules. Meals followed protocols. Staff followed routines refined over generations. Continuity was comforting. It reminded those inside that they had survived worse. What outsiders rarely understood was that the mansion did not exist to celebrate wealth. It existed to normalize restraint. Excess was a liability. Attention was a threat. Comfort was permitted only insofar as it did not weaken discipline. This philosophy created emotional distance not only from the public, but within families. Relationships were formal. Affection was measured. Personal expression often took second place to institutional role. The cost of this approach surfaced quietly, in estrangements, quiet dissatisfaction, and private grief. But, from the family's perspective, sentimentality had destroyed many fortunes. They saw emotional governance as a luxury they could not afford. The mansion reinforced this belief by design. Its grandeur was impersonal. Beauty existed, but intimacy was rare. Even bedrooms reflected this ethos. They were elegant, but restrained. Nothing invited indulgence. Everything suggested order. Living inside the mansion meant constantly remembering that you were a custodian, not an owner. The staff absorbed this culture as well. Long service was respected. Familiarity was not encouraged. Boundaries preserved hierarchy. Everyone knew their place. Stability depended on it. As generations passed, the mansion's darkest secret remained unchanged. Survival required sacrifice. Not dramatic sacrifice, but persistent, quiet denial of personal impulse. Those who accepted this thrived within the system. Those who resisted drifted to its edges. Public fascination with the family's wealth often missed this reality. Outsiders imagined indulgence, decadence, and unchecked privilege. In truth, the mansion was governed more like a monastery than a palace. Discipline replaced freedom. Structure replaced spontaneity. This is why the mansion endured when so many others failed. It was never built to be loved by the world. It was built to outlast it. And that endurance came not from gold or art or influence alone, but from a worldview shaped by fear of collapse. The family never forgot how fragile systems were. They never assumed tomorrow would resemble yesterday. The mansion was a constant reminder of that lesson. Stone walls, symmetrical halls, and quiet rooms reinforced the same message daily. Nothing is permanent except vigilance. That is the legacy hidden behind the facade of old money. Not comfort, not arrogance, but an inherited anxiety refined into method. A fear turned into architecture. A family that built homes not to escape the world, but to survive it. Time eventually reveals what architecture conceals. As decades accumulate, the mansion's purpose becomes clearer to those who live within it. What once felt like protection begins to feel like containment. The walls that shielded the family from chaos also limited transformation. This tension between preservation and adaptation became the quiet fault line running through the estate. By the end of the 20th century, the family no longer feared immediate collapse. Their systems had proven resilient. What they feared instead was erosion, not of wealth, but of relevance. Power had shifted from private drawing rooms to global markets, from handwritten correspondence to algorithms, from inherited authority to public perception. The mansion, for all its endurance, could not command the world the way it once had. Yet abandoning it was unthinkable. The building was more than property. It was a psychological anchor. Leaving it entirely would have felt like admitting vulnerability. So the family did what it had always done. It adapted without announcing the change. Behind closed doors, governance modernized. Trusts replaced informal agreements. Legal structures grew more complex. Financial instruments multiplied. Decisions once made around a table were now distributed across committees, jurisdictions, and time zones. But the mansion remained the symbolic center. Strategy still returned there. Ritual still mattered. This is where the darker aspect of continuity emerged. Younger generations, raised amid unprecedented global mobility, felt the mansion's gravity differently. For some, it represented stability. For others, it represented stagnation. They lived in a world that rewarded visibility, speed, and reinvention, values fundamentally opposed to the culture of restraint that defined the estate. Conflicts surfaced quietly, rarely confrontational, never public. They appeared as career choices that drifted away from tradition, as relationships that strained established boundaries, as questions that had once been unaskable. The system responded as it always had, slowly, methodically, without emotion. Accommodation was possible, but only within limits. Innovation was welcomed if it did not threaten structure. Independence was tolerated if it did not weaken unity. The mansion remained the measuring stick. If an action could not be reconciled with its values, it would not be supported. This created a subtle form of attrition. Some heirs remained but disengaged. Others left physically but remained financially tethered. A few broke entirely, becoming cautionary examples discussed in hushed tones. Their absence reinforced the lesson for those who stayed. Belonging required compliance. From the outside, these internal struggles were invisible. The public saw continuity. Estates remained intact. Foundations operated smoothly. Art collections expanded. The illusion of effortless stability persisted. That illusion was one of the family's most valuable assets. But illusions require maintenance. The mansion itself became part of that effort. Preservation projects emphasized heritage. Restoration framed continuity as cultural contribution rather than private control. The building's age became a virtue, its endurance a public good. This reframing protected it from scrutiny. After all, who would question a custodian of history? Yet history inside the mansion was not neutral. It was selective. Certain narratives were preserved, others softened, others omitted entirely. The family understood that memory shapes legitimacy. What is remembered appears inevitable. What is forgotten disappears. This selective memory extended to the mansion's role in financial history. Visitors learned about art, architecture, and philanthropy. They did not learn about leverage, dependency, or quiet influence. Those aspects remained abstract, detached from physical space. For those who lived there, however, the weight of that knowledge was constant. They knew the estate's beauty rested on decisions that had shaped nations. They understood that comfort was built atop responsibility they had not chosen, but could not refuse. This awareness produced a peculiar emotional state, gratitude mixed with obligation, pride tempered by caution. The mansion cultivated this balance deliberately. Its grandeur inspired reverence. Its rules enforced humility. You were never allowed to forget that you were temporary, even within permanence. Staff changes reflected this ethos. New employees were vetted rigorously. Discretion remained paramount. Technology was integrated quietly. Cameras hidden, systems encrypted, communication secured. Modernity entered invisibly, preserving the appearance of timelessness. Externally, the family's influence now operated through institutions rather than personalities. Boards replaced banquets. Regulations replaced favors. Influence became procedural, less personal, more resilient. The mansion no longer needed to host power. It needed only to anchor it. Yet the psychological function of the estate did not diminish. Family members returned there during moments of uncertainty. Deaths, transitions, crises. The mansion absorbed these events silently, offering continuity when the outside world felt unstable. This is the paradox at the heart of the estate. It both constrains and reassures. It limits expression while providing identity. It demands sacrifice while offering belonging. For some, this trade is acceptable. For others, it is suffocating. The darkest secret of the mansion, then, is not what it hides from the public. It is what it asks of those inside. It asks them to subordinate individuality to longevity, to accept that their lives are chapters in a system designed to outlast them. Most families build homes to express who they are. This family built homes to ensure they would still exist. As the world continues to change, the mansion remains, not because it resists change, but because it anticipates it. Its walls have learned patience. Its systems have learned flexibility. Its culture has learned restraint. Whether this model can endure indefinitely is an open question. No structure, however disciplined, escapes time forever. But if the mansion does eventually fade, it will not be due to extravagance or neglect. It will be because the balance between preservation and adaptation finally tipped too far in one direction. Until then, the estate stands quietly, projecting calm, carrying weight, and reminding those within it of a truth they have never allowed themselves to forget. Wealth does not disappear suddenly. It erodes when vigilance ends, and vigilance, in that house, never truly sleeps. Eventually, even vigilance must confront a question it cannot postpone forever. What happens when continuity itself becomes the risk? Inside the mansion, this question emerged not as a crisis, but as a quiet unease. The systems that had preserved wealth for generations were flawless at maintaining stability. What they were less adept at was producing renewal. The same discipline that prevented collapse also resisted transformation. Over time, the family began to recognize a paradox they had spent 2 centuries avoiding. The very structure that protected them might one day limit them. This realization did not trigger rebellion. It triggered analysis. The mansion became a place of assessment rather than reassurance. Meetings once focused on preservation began to include scenario planning. What if capital no longer respected borders the way it once had? What if financial power became decentralized, beyond any family's ability to influence discreetly? What if legitimacy could no longer be inherited, only demonstrated publicly? These were dangerous questions, not because they threatened immediate loss, but because they challenged the foundational assumptions of the system. The family had always believed that restraint, anonymity, and patience would outlast spectacle. But the modern world rewarded exposure. Visibility generated trust. Silence invited suspicion. The mansion absorbed this tension. It did not change outwardly, but its internal purpose shifted again. It became a testing ground for controlled transparency. Certain narratives were allowed to circulate. Carefully framed histories emphasized contribution rather than control. The family's role was recast as stewardship rather than influence. This reframing was deliberate. Stewardship suggests responsibility without dominance. It implies care rather than command. The mansion itself was presented as evidence of this posture, a preserved artifact, a cultural resource, a symbol of continuity offered to society rather than imposed upon it. But inside, the family remained realistic. They understood that narratives are temporary. Power adapts or disappears. The mansion could not function as it once had, but it could still serve as a stabilizing core. The internal rules evolved subtly. Absolute endogamy softened, though strategic compatibility remained essential. Education broadened beyond finance to include technology, law, and global systems. Emotional intelligence gained value not for expression, but for navigation. The system adjusted without surrendering authority. This transition was not seamless. Generational friction increased. Younger members questioned whether invisibility still served a purpose. Older ones warned that visibility attracted volatility. The mansion witnessed these debates quietly, its walls indifferent to ideology. What resolved the tension was not consensus, but hierarchy. Decisions still flowed upward. The system still favored caution. Experimentation was permitted only at the edges. Core assets, core values, and core authority remained untouched. The mansion's physical spaces reflected this compromise. New rooms were adapted for modern work, but hidden behind traditional facades. Technology integrated into old frameworks. The building continued to signal permanence while functioning dynamically beneath the surface. Externally, the family's profile shifted. They appeared less monolithic, more distributed. Influence operated through professionalized entities rather than personal networks. This dispersion reduced scrutiny. It also diluted identity. The name remained powerful, but less singular. Inside the mansion, this dilution was unsettling. Identity had always been the anchor. The estate had taught every generation who they were and what they were for. As that clarity softened, anxiety resurfaced. Not about money, but about meaning. The mansion responded in the only way it knew how, by reinforcing ritual. Annual gatherings continued. Traditions were maintained meticulously. History was retold internally with renewed emphasis. The past became a stabilizing narrative against an uncertain future. This reliance on memory carried its own risk. Nostalgia can preserve, but it can also blind. The family walked a careful line, honoring legacy without becoming captive to it. One truth remained unchanged. The mansion was not sentimental. It did not exist to comfort emotions. It existed to structure behavior. Its routines reminded inhabitants that they were participants in something larger than themselves. Those who embraced this found clarity. Those who resisted felt constrained. The system made no apology for this. It had never promised happiness. It promised survival. Public fascination with the mansion intensified as inequality widened globally. It became a symbol onto which outsiders projected fantasies and resentments. The family anticipated this. They had always known that invisibility would one day fail. What mattered was not avoiding attention, but surviving it. The mansion's final adaptation, then, was psychological. It ceased to define power as control over outcomes and redefined it as resilience amid unpredictability. The goal was no longer to shape the world quietly, but to remain intact, regardless of how the world shifted. This shift reduced ambition, but increased durability. The family accepted a smaller role in exchange for longevity. The mansion no longer needed to be central. It needed to be continuous. And so it stands today, not as the command center it once was, but as a stabilizing relic that still performs its original function quietly. It trains restraint. It enforces memory. It disciplines identity. The dark secret behind the old money mansion was never greed or conspiracy. It was the willingness to subordinate everything, emotion, individuality, even relevance, to continuity. Most fortunes die because they are enjoyed. This one survived because it was managed like a system that never allowed itself to relax. The mansion did not make the family powerful. It made them patient. And patience, more than power, is what allowed them to last. When viewed from the outside, the mansion now appears almost benign. Its presence feels historical rather than strategic, cultural rather than controlling. That impression is intentional. The family understands that power which insists on being noticed is already weakening. What survives longest is what blends into the background of normal life. Yet internally, the logic that built the estate has never been abandoned. It has simply been refined. The mansion no longer coordinates nations or negotiates wars, but it still performs its original function. It conditions behavior. Every design choice, every preserved rule, every ritual exists to remind those inside that nothing they possess is truly theirs alone. Inheritance within the system remains conditional. Wealth passes through frameworks, not hands. Trusts, boards, and layered oversight ensure that no individual can destabilize the whole. This is the final evolution of the discipline that once governed dining tables and marriage arrangements. Control has become abstract, legal, and nearly invisible. For younger generations, this abstraction is both liberating and alienating. They are spared the overt rigidity of earlier eras, but they are also distanced from direct agency. Power is present everywhere, yet held nowhere. Decisions emerge from processes rather than personalities. Responsibility is shared so thoroughly that ownership feels diluted. The mansion absorbs this change quietly. It no longer needs to intimidate or impress. Its authority is internal. Those raised within its walls understand that resistance is rarely punished openly. It is simply rendered irrelevant. Influence flows to those who align with structure. Others drift outward, still wealthy, but no longer central. This quiet sorting mechanism has proven more effective than confrontation. There are no dramatic expulsions, no public feuds. Distance replaces conflict. Silence replaces judgment. The system protects itself by becoming emotionally neutral. Emotion, in fact, is the one thing the mansion has always treated as dangerous. Passion destabilizes. Impulse exposes weakness. Excess invites scrutiny. The estate's culture trains its inhabitants to regulate desire until it no longer threatens continuity. Comfort is permitted. Indulgence is not. From the outside, this restraint is often misread as arrogance or detachment. In reality, it is defensive. The family never forgot that their rise depended on being useful during instability. Usefulness requires clarity, not emotion. The mansion exists to preserve that clarity across generations. This is why it feels different from other historic estates. Many grand houses are monuments to personalities, eccentric builders, extravagant hosts, dramatic lives. This one is impersonal by design. Its purpose was never expression. It was survival. Even its beauty serves function. Art signals legitimacy. Order signals competence. Age signals permanence. Nothing exists without justification. Nothing remains simply because it is loved. As the global landscape grows more volatile, economically, politically, socially, the mansion's philosophy begins to resemble an anomaly. Most modern systems chase growth, disruption, visibility. This one prioritizes stability, redundancy, and patience. It accepts smaller returns in exchange for lower risk. It trades excitement for endurance. Critics argue that such restraint limits progress. Supporters counter that progress without continuity is collapse disguised as innovation. The family has already chosen its side in that debate. It always has. The mansion, then, stands as a quiet counter-argument to modern wealth culture. It suggests that longevity is not accidental. It is engineered, and that engineering requires denying instincts most people associate with success. There is no triumphalism here, no celebration, only maintenance. The final dark truth behind the old money mansion is not secrecy or manipulation. It is the acceptance of a life governed by limits, a life where identity is inherited but never owned, where comfort is earned but never indulged, where relevance is secondary to resilience. Most people build wealth to change their lives. This family built wealth to prevent change, and the mansion, silent, restrained, enduring, is the physical embodiment of that choice. The true measure of the mansion's success is not how long it has stood, but how completely it has shaped the psychology of those who pass through it. By the time an individual understands the rules explicitly, they have already internalized them. This is how continuity survives without force. The system does not need to be enforced loudly. It reproduces itself quietly through expectation, habit, and silence. From early childhood, life inside the mansion follows a rhythm that appears gentle but is deeply instructional. Days are structured. Education is rigorous but controlled. Curiosity is encouraged only within boundaries. Questions about history are welcomed. Questions about authority are not. Over time, this produces a particular mindset: analytical, restrained, forward-looking, and cautious to the point of instinct. This conditioning is not accidental. The family learned early that written rules could be challenged, but culture could not. Laws change, contracts expire, social norms erode. But a worldview instilled before adulthood becomes self-policing. The mansion is designed to be that worldview made physical. Every space reinforces it. Corridors are long and orderly, discouraging haste. Rooms are proportioned for conversation, not spectacle. Nothing overwhelms the senses. Even grandeur is measured. This restraint teaches patience. It teaches that power does not rush. The psychological effect is cumulative. Those raised inside the estate learn to delay gratification effortlessly. They grow comfortable with waiting, with ambiguity, with incomplete information. In financial terms, these traits are invaluable. In personal terms, they can be isolating. Unlike families where wealth expresses itself through abundance and permissiveness, this environment limits emotional range. Joy is present, but muted. Conflict exists, but managed. Passion is redirected into acceptable channels: study, mastery, stewardship. Raw expression is seen as inefficient. This emotional economy creates individuals who appear composed under pressure. They rarely panic. They rarely boast. They rarely reveal urgency. To outsiders, this can seem cold. Internally, it is seen as competence. But competence has a cost. Many who grow up within this system struggle later with spontaneity. Choice feels weighty. Decisions are evaluated for downstream consequences far beyond personal satisfaction. Even freedom becomes strategic. This is not imposed consciously. It is absorbed. The mansion reinforces this by minimizing unpredictability. Staff turnover is low. Traditions repeat. Even seasonal changes are anticipated and ritualized. Stability becomes the default expectation. When disruption occurs, it is treated as an anomaly, to be contained, not embraced. This mindset explains why the family historically avoided revolutionary movements, sudden innovations, and speculative excess. Not because they lacked imagination, but because imagination without control is dangerous. The mansion exists to remind its inhabitants of this lesson daily. As the modern era accelerated, this worldview increasingly clashed with external reality. Markets became faster, information became public, influence decentralized. The skills that once guaranteed survival, silence, patience, opacity, were now questioned. Yet the family did not abandon them. Instead, it refined their application. Silence became discretion. Patience became long-term positioning. Opacity became complexity. The mansion adapted internally to support these shifts. Legal expertise replaced personal networks. Compliance replaced favor. Distance replaced dominance. But the emotional architecture remained intact. Those who entered the mansion as adults often sensed this immediately. The calm felt different. It was not welcoming warmth. It was controlled neutrality. Conversations were polite but measured. Humor existed, but rarely at another's expense. Nothing was careless. This atmosphere discouraged vulnerability. Personal struggles were handled privately or professionally, never socially. Emotional dependence was seen as a liability. Self-sufficiency was prized. Over generations, this produced a family culture that valued competence over charisma, reliability over brilliance, continuity over ambition. Leaders emerged not because they dazzled, but because they endured. The mansion itself became a selection mechanism. Those who thrived within its constraints rose naturally. Those who chafed against them drifted outward. This was not cruelty. It was filtration. Outsiders often imagine that such a system must be suffocating. In some cases, it is. But for those who align with it, the mansion provides something rare: clarity. Life has rules. Identity has structure. Purpose is defined. In a chaotic world, this can feel like security rather than confinement. The darker implication is that this security depends on narrowing possibility. The mansion does not encourage experimentation that threatens stability. Risk is calculated, not emotional. Failure is tolerated only if contained. This is why innovation within the family tends to be incremental rather than disruptive. New ventures are layered atop existing frameworks. Nothing replaces the core. Everything reinforces it. The estate's art collections mirror this philosophy. They emphasize mastery, tradition, and continuity. Radical movements are represented only after validation. Nothing is celebrated for shock alone. Even creativity is disciplined. This disciplined creativity extends to philanthropy. Causes are selected not for urgency, but for alignment with long-term stability. Education, culture, health, systems that reinforce order. Rarely movements that challenge power structures directly. From the family's perspective, this is not hypocrisy. It is consistency. They believe disorder harms everyone, especially the vulnerable. Stability, even imperfect stability, is preferable to chaos. Critics argue that such thinking preserves inequality. Supporters argue that inequality is inevitable, and instability worsens it. The mansion does not host this debate openly. It acts according to its own conclusions. What is undeniable is that this worldview has worked. While countless fortunes dissolved through indulgence, mismanagement, or visibility, this one endured. The mansion stands as proof that emotional restraint can be as valuable as financial acumen. But endurance is not immortality. As the 21st century advances, new pressures emerge that the mansion cannot fully neutralize. Public distrust of institutions grows. Transparency is demanded. Historical accountability intensifies. Silence is no longer interpreted as dignity, but as evasion. The family responds cautiously. Statements are crafted. Archives are curated. Engagement increases selectively. But the instinct remains defensive. Control over narrative is still paramount. The mansion adapts again, this time as a buffer between history and scrutiny. Certain stories are emphasized, others are contextualized, some remain unexplored. This is not deception so much as prioritization. Every institution does it. The difference is the scale of consequence. Inside the family, awareness of this tension is growing. Younger members understand the optics of power. They navigate public life more fluently, but they are still constrained by internal expectations. Visibility is permitted only with discipline. The mansion enforces this balance subtly. It does not forbid expression, it shapes it. Those who speak publicly do so carefully. Those who engage socially do so strategically. Nothing is impulsive. This restraint frustrates some. They see peers leveraging openness to build influence rapidly. They wonder whether patience still pays. The mansion offers no reassurance, it offers precedent. Precedent says that speed fades. Noise attracts backlash. Systems outlast personalities. This belief is not romantic, it is pragmatic, and it continues to govern behavior. At its core, the mansion is an environment optimized for long-term survival at the expense of short-term satisfaction. This trade-off defines every aspect of life within it. Comfort exists, but it is restrained. Luxury exists, but it is justified. Freedom exists, but it is conditional. The darkest aspect of this arrangement is not its rigidity, but its effectiveness. It works precisely because it denies the very impulses that undo most wealth. Most fortunes collapse when heirs confuse access with ownership, comfort with entitlement, freedom with immunity. The mansion prevents this confusion by never allowing anyone to forget their role. You are not the source of the wealth. You are not its purpose. You are its temporary guardian. This message is never spoken aloud. It does not need to be. It is embedded in the architecture, the routines, the silences. And that is why the mansion endures, not as a relic of excess, but as a functioning system of restraint. It is not a place where people go to feel powerful. It is a place where power is taught to wait. And waiting, in the long arc of history, has proven to be the most dangerous advantage of all. The consequences of that waiting mindset extend far beyond finance. Over time, it reshapes how those inside the mansion understand risk, morality, and even time itself. Most people experience time emotionally: urgency, deadlines, anticipation, regret. Inside the estate, time is treated structurally. Years are units, decades are phases, generations are strategies. This altered perception creates distance from the present moment. Events are rarely judged on how they feel now, but on how they will age. A decision that causes discomfort today may be praised decades later if it preserves continuity. Conversely, a choice that brings immediate satisfaction but weakens structure is viewed as irresponsible, even immoral. This framework explains why the family has historically appeared indifferent to public opinion during moments of criticism. Reputation damage is tolerated if it is temporary. What matters is whether the underlying system remains intact. The mansion reinforces this by making short-term reactions feel small. Its scale dwarfs urgency. Its permanence mocks panic. Living in such an environment teaches a subtle form of emotional detachment. Empathy exists, but it is filtered through calculation. Compassion is expressed institutionally rather than personally. Support is provided through systems, not spontaneity. This reduces emotional volatility, but also limits intimacy. For those raised elsewhere, this can feel unsettling. Relationships inside the mansion rarely escalate quickly. Trust is gradual. Disclosure is measured. Bonds are durable, but slow to form. Everything follows the logic of endurance. This has implications for how the family engages with the wider world. Crises that provoke immediate outrage elsewhere are approached analytically. Human suffering is acknowledged, but responses are designed for scale, not catharsis. Aid is structured, monitored, evaluated. Emotional urgency is considered unreliable. Critics see this as coldness. Internally, it is viewed as responsibility. The mansion teaches that emotional reactions feel moral, but often produce unstable outcomes. Stability, even when imperfect, saves more lives over time. This belief system is not unique to this family, but the mansion preserves it with unusual purity. There are few counterweights, no chaotic branches, no indulgent offshoots. Deviations are absorbed or isolated before they spread. This is why the estate never became a symbol of decadence. There were no legendary excesses, no notorious scandals tied to the building itself. When scandals occurred, they were personal, not systemic. The structure remained untouched. The mansion's greatest defense has always been boredom. There is nothing sensational inside, no theatrical luxury, no unpredictable drama. Even conflict feels procedural. This discourages obsession, both internally and externally. People rarely fixate on what does not entertain them. In an age driven by spectacle, this is a profound advantage. As media cycles accelerate, attention spans shorten, and outrage becomes currency, the mansion remains deliberately uninteresting. Its power does not announce itself. It does not provoke. It waits. Waiting, however, is increasingly misunderstood. Modern culture equates speed with intelligence, disruption with progress, exposure with legitimacy. The mansion represents the opposite philosophy. It suggests that restraint can outperform brilliance, that silence can outlast noise, that systems beat personalities. This belief places the family in quiet opposition to the dominant cultural narrative. They do not argue against it publicly, they simply do not participate in it. The mansion functions as an opt-out mechanism from modern volatility. Inside, this detachment is framed as wisdom. Outside, it is often misread as aloofness or arrogance. The family accepts this misreading. They understand that correcting perception would require engagement, and engagement invites entanglement. The estate teaches that you cannot control how others interpret your silence, only how you structure your survival. This mindset produces an unusual relationship with morality. Actions are judged less by intent than by outcome. Good intentions that lead to instability are failures. Uncomfortable decisions that preserve continuity are successes. Ethical frameworks are pragmatic rather than idealistic. This pragmatism is the mansion's most controversial legacy. It allows for choices that outsiders find troubling, but it also prevents impulsive harm. The system values predictability above righteousness. Whether this is ethical depends on perspective. The mansion does not seek moral approval, it seeks durability. Over time, this produces a family culture that rarely apologizes. Apologies imply emotional error. The system acknowledges miscalculations privately and corrects them quietly. Public remorse is seen as performative and destabilizing. This is why historical reckoning has been particularly challenging. As societies demand acknowledgement, transparency, and accountability, the mansion's instinct is to contextualize rather than confess. Context feels safer than contrition. This approach works poorly in the short term. It invites criticism. But the family evaluates response strategies over decades, not news cycles. The mansion teaches that outrage burns hot and fast. Structures endure. Still, pressure accumulates. As wealth inequality becomes more visible and institutions face declining trust, the very qualities that preserved the mansion now attract scrutiny. Silence looks evasive. Complexity looks manipulative. Continuity looks exclusionary. The family is not blind to this. Internally, discussions continue. How much adaptation is possible without surrendering core principles? How much visibility can be tolerated without destabilizing structure? Where is the line between stewardship and withdrawal? The mansion does not provide answers. It provides a framework for deciding slowly. This slowness frustrates younger members who grew up in a world of instant feedback and rapid iteration. They understand the cultural shift intuitively, but they are constrained by a system that distrusts speed. Some attempt to reconcile both worlds. They engage publicly, but cautiously. They speak in generalities. They emphasize values rather than power. They frame wealth as responsibility rather than inheritance. These efforts are permitted, but monitored. The mansion allows experimentation at the edges, never at the core. If engagement threatens stability, it is curtailed. This tension will define the mansion's future more than any financial challenge. Money adapts easily. Culture does not. What remains constant is the estate's underlying assumption that survival requires limits, that freedom without structure destroys itself, that power without restraint attracts enemies. The mansion exists to remind its inhabitants of these beliefs when the outside world tempts them otherwise. In this sense, it functions less like a home and more like an institution. It trains behavior. It filters identity. It preserves a worldview that has outlived monarchies, empires, and ideologies. Whether that worldview remains viable indefinitely is uncertain, but its track record commands respect, even from critics. The darkest secret of the old money mansion, then, is not secrecy or influence. It is discipline sustained across centuries. A discipline so thorough that it no longer feels imposed, only natural. A discipline that transforms wealth from something you use into something that uses you. And a discipline that asks, quietly but relentlessly, whether survival is worth the life it demands. So far, the answer within those walls has always been yes. What is rarely discussed outside the family is the emotional afterlife of such discipline. Systems that survive for centuries do so by minimizing failure, but they also minimize release. Over time, this creates a subtle accumulation of unexpressed tension, managed, redirected, but never fully discharged. The mansion absorbs it. Inside the estate, silence is not emptiness. It is pressure distributed evenly. Conversations are calm because intensity has already been processed internally. Decisions appear effortless because conflict has been resolved long before words are spoken. This creates an atmosphere that feels controlled rather than peaceful. Those who visit briefly often mistake this for serenity. Those who live within it understand the difference. The mansion does not encourage emotional collapse, but it does not allow emotional excess either. Grief is acknowledged, then organized. Celebration is permitted, then concluded. Nothing lingers long enough to disrupt rhythm. Time keeps moving, and the system moves with it. This is how continuity protects itself from the unpredictability of human nature. The danger, however, is that systems built to survive can forget why survival mattered in the first place. Over generations, the original threats, poverty, exile, persecution, instability, fade into abstraction. What remains is habit. Discipline persists even when its original justification is no longer felt personally. This creates a generational divide, not over money, but over meaning. Older members remember fragility through inherited memory. Stories told at the table, lessons repeated, warnings embedded in tradition. Younger members experience security as default. The urgency that once made restraint feel necessary now feels theoretical. The mansion attempts to bridge this gap through repetition. History is retold. Precedent is emphasized. Failures of other families are cited. The lesson is clear. Comfort breeds carelessness, and carelessness invites collapse. But repetition alone cannot recreate fear. As that fear softens, discipline must rely more heavily on structure than belief. This is where the system becomes heavier, more procedural, less intuitive. Rules proliferate. Oversight increases. Flexibility narrows. From the inside, this feels like safety tightening into constraint. The mansion responds by reinforcing its institutional identity. It emphasizes role over personality, contribution over expression, stewardship over enjoyment. The family becomes less a group of individuals and more a collective mechanism. This shift is subtle but consequential. It changes how members relate to one another. Relationships become professionalized. Affection is expressed through reliability rather than intimacy. Trust is demonstrated through consistency, not disclosure. This is not dysfunction in the traditional sense. It is coherence taken to an extreme. And extremes, even functional ones, carry risk. As the outside world becomes more transparent, more expressive, more emotionally literate, the mansion's culture begins to appear increasingly foreign. What once read as dignity now reads as distance. What once read as restraint now reads as avoidance. The family understands this perception shift, but does not fully share its values. Emotional display is seen as volatile. Vulnerability is seen as leverage. The mansion teaches that what feels authentic can also be exploited. This belief is not paranoia. It is historical memory refined into instinct. As a result, adaptation remains cautious. Engagement is filtered. Language is controlled. Identity is managed. The mansion continues to function as a pressure regulator, ensuring that whatever enters the system does not destabilize it. The cost of this regulation is personal spontaneity. Many inside learn to self-edit constantly. Thoughts are evaluated before being voiced. Desires are weighed against consequence. Choices are framed in terms of impact, not preference. This produces individuals who are highly capable, but often internally divided. They are trained to manage systems, but not always to inhabit themselves freely. Fulfillment, when it occurs, is quiet and contained. Yet the system endures because it delivers certainty in an uncertain world. Those who remain within it accept the trade consciously or unconsciously. Freedom is exchanged for belonging. Expression is exchanged for continuity. The mansion makes this exchange feel natural. It does so by embedding structure into everyday life so completely that alternatives feel chaotic. Outside choices appear impulsive. Outside lifestyles appear fragile. The world beyond the gates seems loud, reactive, unstable. This contrast reinforces loyalty. Even those who leave often return, if only psychologically. The mansion's worldview lingers. It becomes a reference point against which all other experiences are measured. In this way, the estate exerts influence long after physical presence ends. It shapes decision-making, risk tolerance, and self-perception. It produces a shared internal language that persists across distance. This is the mansion's most enduring power, not control over capital, but control over orientation. It teaches its inhabitants how to stand in the world. As long as that orientation persists, the system survives. The future will test this model more severely than any previous era. Cultural pressure for transparency will intensify. Moral expectations will sharpen. Wealth will become harder to justify without visible contribution. Silence will be interrogated. The mansion is preparing, as it always has, by adjusting quietly. Structures will evolve. Language will soften. Engagement will increase, selectively. But the core will remain unchanged. Because the family believes, above all else, that systems which abandon their core to appease the moment do not survive the next one. Whether this belief continues to serve them is an open question. The mansion does not speculate publicly. It waits. And waiting, for this system, is not passivity. It is strategy refined to its purest form. A strategy built not to win the present, but to outlast it.